Hi folks, today we're going to work on this art print in Illustrator. We'll experiment with the live paint tool, we'll work with gradients, we'll use the blend tool, we'll play with some of the blending modes available in Illustrator, and we'll also work with some of the envelope distorts and the effects available within the program. So let's start off by opening up the file here. So in the starter file, you'll see that it's a mostly blank canvas. I've got a bleed line around here. I add this bleed line because I am planning on printing this out later. But you should just see kind of a blank canvas with this outline of a frog. If you go over into the layer panel, if you don't automatically see this off to your right, just go to Window and Layers. You'll see there's already a bunch of pre-made graphics in here. For right now, just make sure everything's off except the layer called frog. That way it's just going to make it a little bit easier for us to color it in and see the line work we're messing with. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the live paint tool to color in this frog. Now the reason we're using the live paint tool rather than just doing the traditional method where we change our fills and our strokes on stuff is because when I drew this frog here, I used the blob brush tool here instead of the regular paintbrush tool. Now the difference between these two brushes is, I'm just going to grab a random color here. So if I color in a blob with the paintbrush tool, and then I use the blob brush tool to make the same kind of shape, you see they look really similar, but when I go over with my direct selection tool, you can see the paintbrush tool created all these extra anchor points, whereas the blob brush tool just added anchor points around the outer edges of the shape. This is because the paintbrush tool is meant for making strokes, so that way you can kind of create really organic shapes super easy. So you can just paint in the shape you want to use, and then just join the ends, and then you can mess with the stroke and the fill really easy. With the blob brush tool, it creates shapes. So rather than doing like an outline like this, if you wanted to just make a little graphic real quick that's colored in, so let's just pretend I did a good job coloring this. I could then change the fill up here. I could add a stroke to the outside of the shape. But another reason why I like using the blob brush tool is if you have a pressure sensitive device, is it will actually let you use pen pressure when you draw things. So if I double click on the blob brush tool, and this is how I can change the size. I can just use this slider or type in a number over here. But I can also go down to this drop down menu here, and usually by default it's set to fixed. But if I change it to pressure, I can change how much variation it creates when I press down with my tool, and it creates a more natural look to my line work. It looks a bit more like I used a natural pen or I used like a calligraphy brush to create my line work. So because the blob brush tool lets me use pen pressure, usually what I do when I create artwork in Illustrator is I'll do all of my line work with the blob brush tool. So that way I can get these heavy to thin lines and this variation in the width of it really easy by just kind of controlling how hard I'm pressing down with my pen. And then I'll usually make another layer, put it underneath my line work, and then just color it in again with a blob brush, except I will usually make the brush a little bit bigger so that way it's easy to color everything in. But that can be a bit of a time consuming process. So another way that we can color in this particular graphic here is rather than taking all that time to try and color it in manually, we're going to use our live paint bucket tool. What the live paint bucket tool lets us do is it will look at our artwork here and it will kind of detect where our paths and anchor points are and where certain things are filled in, and it'll look for gaps for where we're clicking and try and fill in those gaps by just kind of detecting where we already have shapes and paths. Alright, so let's go ahead and just jump into using the tool so you can see how it works in action. So first off, with your selection tool, go ahead and just select our frog here. And then go over to your live paint bucket tool. If you don't immediately see it, just look for the shape builder tool or the live paint selection tool. Right click and you should see the live paint bucket tool in that list. Alternatively, you can also hit K on your keyboard, and that should be the shortcut for that particular tool. So once you have this tool selected, you should see like a paint bucket, and there's like 3 squares above it. If you use your left and right arrow keys, it'll cycle through a bunch of different colors. The colors that it is referencing right now are the swatches that I have saved in the project. Now you'll see that it doesn't have the normal selection that you usually see when you open up a new project. That's because I went in and just quickly got rid of all of the swatches that we're not going to use for the project. That way it's going to be a little bit faster and easier for you to cycle through and find the colors that we need to use. It's also a good way to kind of help keep your project organized. If you ever want to kind of clean up your swatches panel in another project, the way you do that, like I did here, you just go into the swatches panel, click on the more options here, hit select all unused swatches, and it'll select every swatch in here that you don't use, and then you just hit the trash can button, and it'll get rid of all of those unused swatches. Now back to the paint bucket tool. Okay, so starting at the none option, I'm going to hit my arrow key, and I'm going to keep hitting my arrow key. I'm going to go past this green, and I'm going to go past the yellow green, past the dark green, so it should be the 4th green you come across. It's kind of this nice bright green here. Once you have that particular swatch selected, just go ahead and click in the main body of our frog here, and it should detect where we had these shapes and just fill in all that empty space that was in this section. Then I'm going to go over to the top of his arm here, click on that, and then I'm going to fill in the thigh with the same green. Okay, so next up is, this time I'm going to hit my left arrow key, and I'm going to cycle back through my swatches until I get to that royal blue swatch. It should be between a green and a red swatch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to fill in these squares here on his belly with that blue. And then I'm going to go ahead and fill in his inner thighs and kind of this sleeve on his arms as well. Alright, next up is I'm going to hit my right arrow key, twice to get to the orange, and then we're just going to fill in his feet with orange. Make sure you get the front and the back. And then I'm going to hit my right arrow key one more time, so that way I have yellow selected. I'm going to click here to fill in that part of his belly, and here to fill in that part of his belly. And then I'm going to zoom in on his eye up here. And I'm going to cycle to the left, so I'm just hitting my left arrow key. And I'm going to go until I hit this red color. And I'm just going to fill in that iris right there. And then I'm going to keep hitting the left arrow key. So cycle through your colors. I kept hitting the left arrow, but cycle through them until you get to this brown. It should be between like a dark hunter green and a turquoisey dark blue color. And then just fill in the pupil with that dark reddish brown. And you can see in just a few seconds here, we completely filled in our frog without having to sit there with our blob brush tool and slowly paint everything in and going with the erase tool to refine everything. You can see the live paint bucket tool is pretty good about figuring out where empty spaces are and filling them in. Now remember, in order to get this to work, you do have to select your object first, because what it does is it converts that object into a live paint group. To make our lives a little bit easier is, now that we have the base colors in there, I'm just going to go ahead and select this. And then if you have your properties panel open, you can go into your quick actions and hit expand, or you can go into object, expand, and then just make sure object, fill in, stroke, or check marked, hit OK. And this turns it more into a traditional object where I'm just going to ungroup it real quick. You might have to ungroup it a couple times. There we go. So after you ungroup it a couple times, that kind of separates out everything into regular paths and fills. And this will allow us to add some gradients to our frog to help them pop a little more and add a little bit of realistic lighting to them, or semi-realistic. Okay, so for this next part, you can either ungroup your frog like I just did, and remember you can ungroup it by either using your quick actions in the property panel, or you can right click ungroup to unleak everything. Another way that you can change the colors like we're about to do is if it is grouped, just double click on it. It goes into isolation mode and you can select individual objects within that group and change them as need be. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it in a group and just work with it in isolation mode. That way I don't have to worry about remembering to regroup it later on. So first off, what we're going to do is however you want to work with this group, whether you actually ungroup it or you're just working with it in isolation mode, go ahead and find your gradient panel. And I'm looking for the gradient panel, not the gradient tool. So the gradient panel will be off to your right. If you don't immediately see it, just go to Window, Gradient, and you'll find it in the list there. So I've got my gradient panel open. And the first thing we're going to mess with is let's go down to the thigh over here. Go and select the green shape here. And then within the gradient panel, you can either click on the gradient preview up here, or you can click on this slider here and it will apply whatever default gradient is already in there. Okay, so once we have a gradient applied to it, we can now go ahead and start editing it. So some things to kind of go over are this is your gradient preview. This kind of shows you what it's going to look like once you've changed all of your settings. This shows you the fill and the stroke. You can apply a gradient to either the fill or the stroke, or you can add it to both. Right now we're just working within the fill. Then you've got your types up here. The first one is linear, then you've got radial, and then you've got what's called a freeform gradient. We'll go into each of these here in a sec. And if you want to kind of fine tune where the gradient kind of spreads on a shape, you can hit edit gradient and that will automatically take you to the gradient tool and I'll bring this up. We'll go into that more in a sec. So I'm just going to switch back over to my selection tool. Then you've got these stroke options. This only matters for when you're applying a gradient to a stroke. We'll go into that later. This controls the angle of it. So right now, because we have a linear gradient, if I hit 90 degrees, it's going to rotate my gradient in that direction. You can also manually type in an option here. I'm going to rotate my gradient so that way the white is kind of at the top of his knee and the black is at the bottom of it. So let's say around, I think negative 45 degrees is a good option here. And then you've got this aspect ratio here. This is only available when you have a radial gradient selected. This lets you choose whether your radial gradient is more in a circle shape or if you want the gradation to be more in an oval shape. We'll see more of that when we actually use the radial gradient later. And then you've got this reverse gradient option. So if you've done a bunch of editing down on the slider and then you apply it to a shape and realize that you've put everything in the wrong order, rather than having to manually move these stoppers into the right place, what you can do is just hit this reverse option and then your gradient that you designed just automatically flips itself. And then like I said earlier, this is the slider, but within the slider, you've got these circles here that are called stoppers. You'll sometimes hear me refer to them as like little knobs. These let you control where the gradient starts and ends. It lets you control how many colors you can add to a gradient. So if you just go like directly underneath the slider here and click, it will add another stopper. And in order to delete a stopper, you just click and drag it away. If you want to edit the colors on the stopper, just double click on it and it'll bring up a color menu. You can either use the slider, your swatches, or you can use the eyedropper tool. And then this little diamond here is your midpoint. This lets you control how fast one color gradates into another. So like if I click and drag this, you can see that over on the leg here, it's mostly white, and then at the end, it very quickly transitions to black. For right now, I'm just going to leave that at 50%. So I can either kind of manually try and get it in the middle, or what I can do is I can, with that diamond selected, go down to location, just set that to 50%, and it'll automatically put it in the middle. Now you can use location on the midpoint here or any of your sliders. Like you can see that the white one is at 0%. That means it's at the starting point. And the black one is at 100%. That means it's at the end. If I wanted to make sure that I had these sliders evenly spaced out, I can just go in and say, let's say 25, 50, 75. So using this location menu is a good way to kind of get a nice even gradient. For right now, I'm just going to use two colors. When you have a stopper selected, you'll see also the opacity enables itself. This lets you control how see-through a color is. So I'll tell you what, let me switch this around so you can see it a little better happening. So like if for the white one, I set the opacity to 0%, tell you what, let's just pick a random color here. There you go. So if I have the starter color set at 0 opacity, what will happen is it starts off with my black at 100% opacity, and I'll slowly transition into this yellow. But as it gets closer to the yellow, the opacity on it will change and it'll become more transparent. Sometimes I will use this effect when I want to get a feathered look to something, but the feathered effect isn't quite getting me the fine tuning I want. So that is a general overview of our gradient panel. You'll see this more in action as we use the different types of gradients. For right now, let's focus back on our thigh here. So make sure your angle is set at -45. And for our colors here, I'm going to double click on my first stopper. And I want it to be this light green color. So go ahead and select this light green color. And then I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to change the opacity to 100%. Then I'm going to go to the end stopper here. And let's use... Tell you what, let's use this green color that we originally used for the body. So we're going to use this green here. The CMYK code for it is 75070. And then I'm actually going to move this closer to the middle here. So I'm going to select that slider, then I'm going to go down to location, set that to 50, and I'm going to click on the end here to add another stopper. I'm going to drag that to the very end. And I'm just going to double click on it, and this time I'm going to go over into the color palette, and I'm just going to grab the K slider and just kind of drag that up to make a darker green that's still the same type of green as our midtone there. I think 62% or 60% will work on the K slider. Don't change any of the other sliders. And then I'm going to, I think, call it good for the thigh for right now. So again, I just add a very simple gradient. The first one is this yellow-green color. The midtone here is this swatch right here. And then at the very end, I originally grabbed this swatch here and then I went over into the color panel or the color section, and then I just dragged my K slider up until it was around 60%. And then I have the angle set at negative 45 degrees. Okay, now that we have a gradient applied to the thigh over here, let's go ahead and select this blue kind of strip here. And I'll show you an alternative way to work with gradients in here. So what I'm going to do is for this next gradient I'm going to use this yellow green that's already in it, but I want to incorporate this dark blue as well into the gradient. So an easy way to incorporate that color into your gradient without having to save it as a swatch or having to memorize the color code is before you apply the gradient to the shape, just click on the square that has the color you want to use, click and drag it down to the slider, and you'll see this line appears. Go ahead and just place it somewhere towards the end here, and you'll see it incorporates that blue into our gradient. So let's go ahead and get rid of these two greens here. So again, to get rid of a knob here, just click and drag outside of the panel and it will get rid of that knob. So again, click and drag. And then just make sure that this blue slider is at the very end here by clicking and dragging it to the end. Right now what it's doing is it is applying the gradient from this end point to this end point. Now, sometimes you might want that look. Other times you might want the gradient to start a little outside of the shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Edit Gradient, and it'll switch me over to the Gradient tool. And then I'm just going to click up here so that way I'm kind of a little outside of where this anchor point is. I'm going to click and drag, and it's going to add the blue swatch to the very end of the shape, maybe kind of like right here. And you can see that depending on where I click and drag it, it's changing how much of that gradient is applied to the shape itself. So I think I'm going to actually click a little further out so that way that green isn't quite as strong on the leg. I just kind of want it to be a very subtle green and goes into that strong blue. So I'm starting the gradient out here and I'm clicking and dragging kind of right underneath that arc at the end here. And then with the gradient tool I can actually change more of the gradient, so I can actually grab my stoppers here, my sliders, and use that to change how the gradient looks. I can also grab the midpoint to change how fast it transitions. And if I want to change kind of where it's positioned on the shape, if you click on the white bar here, you can click and move your gradient around. If you have a radial gradient selected, there is another like dotted line around the outside that lets you control how oval your gradient is and what direction that oval is pointed. So right now, just click and drag to get a gradient that looks similar to what I have right here. Then I'm going to switch over to my selection tool. I'm going to select the other inner thigh right here. I'm going to click within my panel to apply the gradient to it. Then I'm going to grab my gradient tool and I'm going to click and drag the gradient so that way that light green kind of starts a little outside of the top of the thigh and the blue stops about here. So when I switch over to my selection tool, you should have a gradient that looks similar to this. Alright, so that was a linear gradient. Next, let's use a radial gradient. So next up is I'm going to zoom in on the eye up here. I'm going to select the red. I'm going to apply the gradient to it. And then another way to change the color of the stoppers here is if I go over to my swatches panel, I'm going to grab that red that we used. I'm going to click and drag it over to the slider. Make sure you're hovering over the slider, then let go, and it should change the color of it. So make sure this one's red. And then I'm going to grab the orange. I'm going to click and drag that over to the second stopper. And there we go. So right now I've got a linear gradient. What I want is a radial gradient. So I'm going to go back into my panel here. I'm going to click on the second option. Now the idea is I want the lighter orange to kind of ring my pupil here, and I want the outer edge to be red. What it's doing is it's putting the orange in the very center and radiating out from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit my gradient. So you can either edit the gradient by hitting the button here, or you can just grab your gradient tool right off the bat. And you can see when I hover over the bar here, it's got this section here that looks like the linear gradient, but now I've got this circle around it. If I click on this solid black circle up here and drag out, it creates more of an oval. And if I click on this circle here, it controls how big my oval is. And if I want to change where the colors are rotating, if I kind of go to the end of the slider here, you should see your cursor change to a arrow circle. You just click and drag, and that rotates your gradient. Now what I want to actually do is I want to click kind of at the edge of the pupil here, and I'm going to drag out to the edge of the eyeball. So that way I've got this orange kind of peeking out from behind the pupil, and the majority of it is red. Because our eyeball is a bit oval shaped, I'm going to grab this black circle and drag it so that way it's more of an oval shape and follows the natural shape of the eye we drew. And then I'm just going to maybe drag that in a little bit more so that way the oval is about the same size as the eyeball. And I'm just going to go to the very edge here, click and drag to rotate it. And then if I click on this white bar here, I can kind of nudge the gradient over so that way I see more of the orange. So there we go. Kind of edit your gradients that way you get a look similar to mine, where you can see some of that orange peeking out behind the pupil, but it's mostly red around the edges. So if I go back to my gradient tool, your gradient selection should have an oval. It's about the same height as the pupil. The orange should be starting at about here, and then the red goes to the very outside edge of the eyeball. And then just leave your midpoint in the midpoint. So next up is let's change the feet on our frog here. So this one, I'm just going to grab this first foot here. I want to apply this orange red gradient, but I'm going to switch the red out for yellow. So I'm going to go back over to my swatches panel, click and drag the yellow over to this slider. If you miss and it just adds the yellow to the red and orange, just grab your red slider and click and drag it off the panel, and then move your yellow to the very end here. And I still want it to be a radial gradient, but I don't want that much yellow to be showing up, so I'm just going to edit the gradient. I want to go to the center of the foot to start the orange, and then I'm just going to drag out. So that way I'm almost touching the tip of these two toes here. Then I'm going to grab my midpoint, and I'm going to drag this up so that way the majority of the foot is orange, and just like the very tips of the toes are yellow. So the tips of these toes are going to be a lot more yellow than these ones. That's fine. So the position of your midpoint, if you're looking at your gradient panel, should be around like 82%. And then I'm going to go over to this foot here. I'm going to apply the gradient again, and I'm going to edit it to make sure I don't have too much yellow. See where the orange is up here, I actually want it to start more from the center of the frog's palm here, so I'm just going to click and drag again. So that way I'm kind of close to the tips. So kind of the edges of his foot are yellow, but the center of his palm is orange. And I'm going to do the same for this foot down here. Just click to apply the gradient, edit the gradient. Make sure you're clicking in the center of his foot and dragging out to the tip of his longest toe. Since this foot is a bit more of an oval shape than what these 2 feet were, I think I'm going to grab this and make it make the spread a bit more oval as well. Just so that way the yellow is kind of, it is touching each of the toes, and I've got a bit of yellow over here as well. And then I'm going to go over here and apply it one more time. Use my edit gradient. And for this one again, I think I'm going to make it a little bit oval rather than using a perfectly circle. And I'm just going to click and drag it so that way the orange starts in the middle of the foot. I use that to make it a bit smaller. There we go. Alright. So you should have feet that look like this. So next up is I want to add a gradient to the main part of the frog here. But the thing is, I'm wanting to add the gradient so that way it kind of creates almost like a bit of lighting to the frog. But if I use the linear or the radial gradients, it's just not going to look quite natural because the light should be hitting kind of the tip of his face here and his knee. But if we just like apply a regular linear gradient to it, it's just not going to create that natural looking lighting. So first off is I don't want to use this yellow orange, so I'm just going to switch over to my eyedropper tool, and I'm going to grab the gradient we used over on the thigh here, and then I'm going to change this to a freeform gradient. So it's your third option next to type. And sometimes it'll keep whatever colors you already have there. Sometimes it'll do what it did on mine. It'll get rid of whatever colors you had. Make sure that draw is set to points. You'll see what lines does here in a sec, but you should see on the shape here, on mine it just has one stopper and it's this gray color. I'm going to go ahead and put this stopper kind of in the middle of his body here, and I'm going to double click on it, and in my swatches panel I'm going to make it this green color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the tip of his nose right here, and you'll see it adds another stopper. And I can then double click on this one, and if I grab, let's say, the yellow green, you'll see it radiates out that yellow green onto the shape here. And when you hover over a stopper, it has that circle that we see with the radial gradient. If you click on that, that controls how strongly a color radiates out from a point. I'm just going to leave that at the default size, and I'm going to bring this stopper up so that way it dominates kind of more of the head here, and it's just very light yellow at the top. Then I'm going to click down here, and I want this stopper to be that same green, and I'm just going to move this down. And then I'm going to click kind of at his butt here, and for this stopper I'm going to make this that dark green color, and I'm just going to add it to the end of his leg here. And then I'm going to click on this stopper up here so that way it kind of saves that color, and I'm going to apply it to the tip of his knee. I'm going to add a stopper right here. I'm going to make this that lighter green we've been using. And I'm just going to move this a little closer to the edge here. And I'm going to move this stopper over to this end of the leg. Maybe add it there as well. So I'm just kind of moving these stoppers around so I get a semi-realistic shading. Again, I'm not going for super realism here. I'm just kind of going for what looks sort of like shading. I'm going to make this a little bit stronger by pulling out on that black circle. And then I'm going to move this one over. I'm going to click up on the top of the eyeball. I'm going to make this one a yellow green. Maybe add another slider in here that's that light green. Come on. Sometimes they can be a little bit tricky to move. I'm going to add another one right there. Maybe this one just a little bit stronger. Maybe this one a little bit stronger. Maybe not that strong. So I think I might move this up just a little bit. Maybe so that way it's around his shoulder blades. So you can see here we have kind of a nice gradation that's kind of creating fake lighting, or at least it's just giving our frog a bit more pop on his skin rather than just using a flat green. So again, I have the light green up here, kind of that mid-tone green in the middle of his body. Then towards the back, I'm using that dark green. On his leg, I'm using that medium green here and here. And again, I'm using that yellow green at the kind of the top of his knee. So then if I switch over to my selection tool, you can kind of get a better idea of what the gradient looks like. If you ever want to go back and re-edit a gradient, you can just select it, and then in the gradient panel, just hit edit gradient, and it'll bring those stoppers back up. So you can either delete them, move them around. If you want to delete a stopper, just click and drag it outside the shape, and it'll disappear. You know what? I think I actually kind of like it better having that yellow-green kind of going across the top of the head here. So I am going to get rid of that one stopper. I'm just going to use these three on the body. Okay, and then I'm going to call that good. Now, when we applied the freeform gradient, you saw next to draw, it had the option between points and lines. What we just used was points. That lets us just add colors within a shape, and it will blend those stoppers depending on where you have everything positioned. If we use lines, that's going to create more control over how a gradient will bend. So we'll use that on the arms here. So I'm going to click here and select this arm. Let's just apply a gradient to it and then select freeform gradient. Okay, so on mine, it added 2 stoppers to it. It doesn't matter how many, it automatically adds to your shape. It'll add at least 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select lines, grab one of your stoppers. It doesn't matter which one you grab, just grab one. And you might have to click on it twice. Click once to select it and then once to actually move it. So click and move it so that way it's starting at the wrist. And if you have lines selected, when you let go of that stopper and drag out, you should see that it's creating a line to my next stopper. So go ahead and go to the elbow here, click to add a new stopper, and then go up to the shoulder here and either create another stopper at the shoulder or connect one that's already there. And you can see it's creating an arc between all of our stoppers here. Okay, so what we can do is you can see as I kind of move around on the shape, I can either add another stopper or I can go back to the beginning and create a ring that's creating that gradient. I'm just going to hit escape on my keyboard to kind of get out of that mode. So that way I can just go back to points. I can select this stopper, double click on it. Let's make this the yellow green. Let's click on this stopper, make that the blue, and then make that stopper blue as well. Let's use the yellow green. There we go. Yep. So I accidentally moved my stopper outside of my wrist. I didn't want to do that. So I'm just kind of adjusting these points so that way the green kind of mostly goes up the forearm here, but once we get up to the bicep, it's just blue to blue. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my selection tool, and I'm going to select this arm here. I'm going to apply a gradient to it. Then I'm going to make it a freeform gradient. I'm going to change draw to lines. I'm going to either make a new stopper or I'm just going to move a pre-existing stopper to the wrist. I'm going to go up to the elbow here. I'm going to connect these 2 stoppers. You can also just create a brand new line. And I'm going to connect this one here. and then just hit escape to get it to stop trying to connect my stoppers. So then I can switch back to points. I can double click on a stopper. Let's use the yellow green up by the wrist. And then use navy blue or royal blue for the closer to the shoulder. There we go. Alright, and then I am going to call that good on the coloring for my frog. If you ungrouped your frog, just make sure you go back in and select everything and group it. Next, what we're going to do is I'm going to go into my layers panel. If you don't see that off to your right, just go to window and layers. And now I can go to the layer called shadow leaf. And I can turn that on and it should have a big leaf and it has a little shadow underneath our frog here. Next is I'm going to turn on water. Okay, so next up is once I have water turned on, I'm going to select this big square here. You should notice that it is extending past the canvas out to our bleed line. This is so when I go to print it, I can guarantee that that color is going to print to the edge of my paper later on. But right now I'm just going to be concerned with selecting the rectangle here, and I want to apply a gradient to it. So I'm just going to click on the gradient slider to apply the gradient. I want to get rid of this middle slider here by clicking and dragging it out. I'm going to double click on this slider. Then in the color palette section, I have a color code already picked out. I'm going to make it 00283F as in frog. Then I'm going to make this one, if I double click on it, the color code for this one is going to be 007A as in apple 82. Then if I hit enter, so I should have like this blue greeny color to this dark blue color. And I want to make sure that I set the type to radial. And I'm going to edit the gradient. And the idea is I kind of want a shape that matches the edge of the leaf here. So I'm going to go for more of an oval shape on my radial gradient. So I'm going to click on this solid black dot along the edge here. I'm going to drag up to make more of an oval shape so that way this edge looks similar to the edge of our leaf. I'm going to click on the white bar here to move my gradient over so that way it's kind of starting at the edge of the leaf. I'm going to click on this black dot with a white outline around it, and I'm just going to extend my gradient out a little bit. Maybe not quite that far. There we go. And then if I go anywhere along the line here, or if I go kind of just outside of the bar, if I click and drag, I can rotate the oval so that way it's kind of going more at the angle of what the leaf is. And I'm just going to move it a little bit more inward. And there we go, I'll call that good. So next up is I want to create my ripples. Now for my ripples, I don't want just the two circles here. I want to add some concentric circles within or in between these two here. Now I can just go grab my ellipse tool and manually make them and do the math to figure out how big I need to add two more circles in here. But an easy way to add concentric shapes like that is to just grab your blend tool, which is this tool right here. I'm going to click on the inner circle, click on the outer circle, and you can see it averaged the size between these two circles and added one in there. Now I want to add an extra circle to it, so I'm going to go to my blend options. There's a couple ways that you can go about that. You can either go into your properties panel and hit blend options, or you can go to object, blend options, or you can just double click on the tool. So by default it's usually set to smooth color. Most time I like to use specified steps. And then I'm just going to bump that up to 2. You can either manually type it or use your up arrow key. And as long as you have preview checkmarked, you can see what that does to your shape over here. So you can see with these two circles what it does is it just averages out the size. But the blend tool can also average out things like color and shape. So you don't have to do this next part here. This is just a short little demonstration with the blend tool. Let's say I have a red circle and a blue star. Okay, so if I grab my blend tool and I go from the red circle to the blue star, you can see since the default is smooth color, what it does is it creates a very smooth transition between these two shapes. But if I go into my blend options, I can do specified steps to control how many shapes are in between the two. So like if I hold down my down arrow key, that will slowly bring down the number of transitions. And you can see it is changing both the color of the fill and it's changing the location and shape of the anchor points on it. Now if you're working with a curve, this kind of changes how those transitions sit on the curve. So to kind of show you how that option can change how stuff sits on the path, I'm just going to quickly make that a curve. Then if I go back into my blend options, and let's turn the steps down so you can see how it rotates a little bit better. Okay, so right now with the orientation, it's kind of keeping everything sitting up straight, but if I change this around to align to path, it'll rotate them, so that way they're following the angle of the path rather than just trying to keep themselves straight up. So that's one option you can do. And then there's the specified distance. What that allows you to do is it lets you control how much difference is between each transition. Now this will also control how many there are, but if the distance between them is easier to figure out or the option you want to mess with, you can use specified distance. Another way to get this look is to use specified steps. But the smaller the specified distance is, the more copies you are going to have, and the larger the specified distance is, the less copies you're going to have. If you've gone and made a blend and you decide you don't want to blend the two objects anymore, a way to release it is to go to Object, Blend, and Release, and it will turn off the blend. It will leave this leftover path here. So if you want to get rid of it, just use your selection tool to select it and delete it. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what the blend tool does. So next I want to add ripples to these as well. So another way that you can blend two objects is you can select one, hold shift, select the other one, and then go to Object and Blend and Make, and then that will create a smooth blend. And then to get into your blend options, you can just go into your properties panel or double click on the tool. So just make sure that specified steps is set to 2, and then go to this set down here. For that one, I'm just going to grab my blend tool. I'm going to click on the inner circle here, click on the outer one. If you're having trouble, and let's say you accidentally click on the rectangle instead of the circle, just undo it. And if you need to, you can always zoom in and make sure you're clicking with that white rectangle. That's kind of the tip of your cursor. And it should try and blend those two shapes. So I'm just double clicking on the tool to get to the blend options. I'm setting it to specified shapes or specified steps, and I want 2 steps in there. And I'm just going to hit OK. Okay, so next is I want to create some ripples. And with the created ripples, I don't want it to be these harsh white lines. I want to create kind of a feathered look, but the feathered effect doesn't work on strokes. You have to change these to fill in order to get the feather effect to apply to it. But also the feather effect can be a little bit finicky. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to use a gradient to create the feathered effect I want. First thing I need to do though is I need to select all of my ripples, Now right now they are live blended objects, which means if I select one of these, I can always go back to my blend options and I can change these how I see fit. But since I want to change the gradients on them, I'm just going to select all three of my blended objects, and I'm going to go to Object, Blend, and Expand, and what it's going to do is it's going to turn off the live effect, and it's just going to make these steps their own individual circles now that are paths. So that's just going to make it a little bit easier to apply our gradient. Oop, wrong button. There we go. So next up is I'm going to go up into my gradient panel, and I'm going to select the stroke. The stroke is the square with the hole in the middle. And I'm going to click and drag this white down into the slider. I'm going to drag this slider off. I'm going to click directly underneath it to add another white slider. I'm going to click and drag this one off. So this way on the left and right side is a white slider. Now the reason I'm making them both white is because what I want to transition is not the color but the opacity. So on this right slider here, I'm going to go down to opacity and set it to 0. And now what it's doing is it's going from 100% opacity white to a 0% opacity white. Now if I go up to stroke here, I have some different options I can pick from. For apply gradient within the stroke is it treats the stroke as if it's a fill and applies it to the whole thing. Apply a gradient along a stroke, what it does is it finds the end point, or it finds the start point of your path and then radiates out from that point to the end point to get the effect. And then there's this option which applies the gradient across the path. So the option we want is apply gradient across the stroke and then make sure the type is set to linear. And then I actually want this hard white edge to be applied to the inner part of the circle, so I'm just going to hit reverse gradient and it's going to automatically flip those colors around. Then I'm going to click on my midpoint here and I'm actually going to move that to 70%. So that way a very small portion of it is that solid white and it very quickly starts transitioning into that more transparent white. So I'm just going to leave my gradient panel up there for right now. We're not going to use it for a minute. I'm going to go back over to my scene here. Now I'm getting closer to the effect I want, but these ripples are still a little stronger than what I want them to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my transparency panel. If you don't immediately see it off to your right, just go to Window and Transparency. And I've got some options here. This first drop down is our blending mode. This controls the opacity or the transparency of what we have selected. And then Make Mask lets us create a clipping mask to hide different parts of elements. Right now, all we're going to concern ourselves with is the blending mode. So first off is normal. That just treats it like a normal solid shape. These first options here will look at whatever color is on top, look at whatever color is on bottom. So in this case, the color on top is white, the color on bottom is our water gradient. And what it does is when it mixes those two colors together, it's going to create a darker effect. So this is handy for like if you want something dark to show through a light color, or if you want to create shadows. This section here is going to mix the colors together to get a lighter effect. This is good for if you want to get like those cool neon effects, or if you want to create highlights within a scene. And then what these do is it kind of controls how the top color is overlaid with color underneath it. So just a plain overlay will just mix the two colors normally. Soft light and hard light treats the top color as if it's a colored spotlight shining on top of the color. And these ones just kind of create different color effects. These ones usually create like weird inverted effects. These ones usually it'll either take the top color or it'll take the bottom color to kind of colorize one or the other. What we're going to use is we're going to use soft light. So that way it just creates a very subtle highlight on our water here. And then if I deselect everything and I go into my layers panel, you can see on either side of the water layer here we have a layer called above and one called below. So if I just temporarily turn off water and turn on above, what above has is it has all the elements that I want to be displayed above the water. So that's going to be the top of the rocks with the moss on them. Then what the below layer has is it has the rocks that are underneath the water, and it also has this thing that's called a musky fish. So it has our fish outline over here as well. So if I turn on the above layer, turn on the water layer, and turn on the below layer, you can see I can see the top of my rocks, but I can't see the bottom of my rocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the rectangle that is our water. Then I'm going to go back to the transparency panel. I'm going to change this blending mode to overlay. So now I still see the highlight of my ripples here, but I can also see the outline of the bottom half of my rocks. So I'm getting closer to the way I want it to look with the water, but not quite. So the first thing I want to do is this moss is way too bright. I want it to kind of blend in with the color that I have on the rocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my moss, and I have to go into the group, so I'll do that one more time. I'm going to go to this rock here. I'm going to double click on it to go into isolation mode, and I'm going to select all the moss here, and I'm going to change this blending mode to color burn, and then I want to change the opacity to, let's say, 60%. That's 60%. So I'm going to hit escape once to get out of that isolation mode, and then I'm going to double click on this rock here, and I want to select all the moss again. If you have trouble selecting all the moss, remember you can go up to select similar objects and set it to fill color, and then it'll select everything within that group that has the same fill color. In order to get that to work, you do need something pre-selected, so select one piece of the moss and then just use fill color as your option or your criteria. Set it to color burn, set the opacity to 60%, then hit escape to get out of that group and go into this one by double clicking on the rock. Select the moss, go to color burn, set that to 60%. There we go. So now I've also got kind of an issue where my rocks are looking very flat. They don't have the same color or lighting effects that I've gotten with the water and kind of with the frog here. So in order to kind of liven these up is I'm going to apply to a gradient to it. But the thing is, tell you what, let me ungroup all my rocks here. So I'm going to select the first one, ungroup, select that one, ungroup, select this one, ungroup. Okay, and now I just want to select the browns of the rock. So I've got all three rocks here selected, and I want to apply a gradient to them to create that lighting effect. But the thing is, I want one gradient to be applied to all three of these objects. And what I mean by that is, so far, like with our frog here, even though there are parts of the frog that share similar gradients, they are separate gradients, and they are applied individually to each shape. I want one big overlaying gradient applied to all these shapes at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have all three of the brown rocks selected. Make sure it's just the brown of the rock and not the moss as well. I'm going to make sure the fill is selected in my gradient panel. Then I'm just going to apply whatever gradient I already have selected in there. So for this stopper here, I'm going to go over to my swatches, and these last three browns are the browns we want to use. So I'm just going to click and drag that over to the very first stopper. I'm going to grab this middle brown and drag it to the middle. If you can't get it perfectly in the middle, just get as close as you can and set the location to 50%. And then for this last one, I'm going to grab this dark brown and apply it to the last slider. So you can see right now it is applying the gradient individually to each shape, which means all three shapes have that light brown, the medium brown, and the dark brown. What I want is I want them to share the same gradient at once, so that way maybe when we apply the gradient, this one's going to have part of the dark and mid-tone brown, this one's going to have some of all three of the colors. The way you can apply one gradient to multiple objects, or to get multiple objects to share a gradient, is just click on your gradient tool, make sure the objects are still selected, and then let's just click out here, click and drag, and you can see it's created 3 gradient strokes here. I forgot to mention earlier, double check that your type is set to linear. If it's set to radial, just click on linear and it'll switch it back over. Now you can see that it figured out what each of these gradients need to be in order for them to share a look. So you can kind of see this one mostly has the dark brown on it, but this one has a bit of the light and the mid-tone. It doesn't have much of the dark brown, whereas this one has quite a bit of the mid-tone and the dark color. So when you use your gradient tool, start off about here, click and drag out to just outside of the little rock to get a look that's similar to what I have here. If you're having trouble getting the right look, just have all 3 selected, click and drag it as close as you can, and then you can set the angle to this negative 37.5 degrees. Okay, and then if I deselect them, that's kind of how my rocks are. Okay, so next I want to create kind of I want to make it look like that there's water lapping at the rocks here to make it seem a bit more natural. I don't want to use the white because it'll look too much like the ripples over here. I just want a very subtle color change. So I'm going to select one of my rocks here, then I'm going to go over to my swatches panel, make sure your stroke is selected, and I'm going to click this turquoisey color, and I'm going to hit my up arrow, and I'm going to set this to, I'm going to set the stroke size to 5 points. Now you can either change these over here or you can change it up here. So make sure the stroke is that turquoisey color and it's set to 5 points wide. Then I'm going to go into the appearance panel, because if I deselect it, you can see it's kind of getting to the look I want, but it's still a little stronger than I'd like it to be. So if I go into the appearance panel, you can see that it should have stroke, opacity is set to default, fill, opacity is set to default, and then it just has a general opacity set to default. So what this opacity controls is it controls the opacity of the entire shape here, both the fill and the stroke. But you see the opacities underneath the fill and stroke. This one just controls the opacity of the fill without touching the stroke, and this one controls the opacity of the stroke without touching the fill. This is the one we want to change. So in order to change it from default to the percentage we want, go ahead and click on the word opacity, and then just set it to, I think 20% will look nice. Let's maybe bump that up to 30, see how that looks. I think 30% is a good look. So we're going to do that for all our rocks here. So I'm going to select this rock as well. I'm going to go into swatches, make sure I have my stroke selected by clicking on it. Select this turquoise color, set it to 5 points. Go into the appearance panel, click on the word opacity directly under stroke. Set that to 30. Go down to my last rock here. Set the turquoise, 5 points. And opacity set at 30%. So there we go. And I think I want to regroup the moss with the rock here. So I'm going to go back to my layers panel. I'm going to lock the water and I'm going to lock the below layer. And I do that by just clicking in that little square here. It will lock it when you click in. Then I'm just going to select, hit Control or Command G to group them back together. So there we go. All right, next is if you're kind of looking into water like this and you have a rock like this that's going into the water, as it goes deeper into the water, especially if it's really murky like river or pond water, this edge isn't going to be very defined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to soften up this edge. So I'm going to unlock the below layer. I'm going to leave water locked. So on the below layer, I'm going to select this shape here. Then I'm going to go to Effect, Stylize Feather, and I'm going to set this to 0.25 inches. And if you turn on preview, you can see what that looks like. I'm going to hit OK. And now, if I go back to my appearance panel, with this rock still selected, it's showing me what information I have for the stroke and the fill on it. But then I can also see it's added feather to the list. So every time you add an effect to a shape, it will add it to the list in the appearance panel. And if you change your mind later on, and maybe you want to hide the effect because it's bogging down your RAM or it's bogging down your computer, or perhaps you just want to delete it altogether, you can just select it from the list and hit that trash can. If you decide you want to go back and edit an effect, you can just go to the appearance panel, double click on the title, and it will bring those options right back up and you can adjust it to whatever new look you need. So I'm going to go over here. Another way to add a effect to a shape is in the appearance panel. Just hit this FX to add a new effect. Go to Stylize Feather. We're going to set the radius to 0.25 on that one as well. Hit OK. Then we're going to select that shape, add a new effect to it. Because this rock is so much bigger, if we use the 0.25, the underneath part of the rock almost disappears. So we're going to bring that down to 0.125 inches. I'm going to hit OK. And that should get us the effect we want with the rocks. Alright, so we're almost done here. We've got mostly the way we want, but we've got some empty space over here. So we're going to use this fish shape I already have made over here to add a bit more interest to it. But if I kind of just move, if I move the fish over here, tell you what, I'm going to temporarily lock the above layer so that way I don't accidentally grab anything again. So if I just kind of move my fish in here and rotate them around, they kind of look a little bit boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an envelope distort to change the shape of my fish without having to completely redraw another fish. So with my selection tool selected, I'm going to click on my template here. I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard and I'm going to click and drag to make a duplicate of the musky fish. And then I want this fish to kind of be swimming almost like a snake in that S shape. So I'm going to select this object. Then I'm going to go to Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Warp. And right now it's set to arc. I'm going to click on this drop down and set it to, let's see, is it flag or wave? I like wave, so set the style to wave. Make sure it's set to vertical, and this bend lets you control how the object bend. Now do keep in mind it does create some distortions, like on this one. A little bit of distortion looks great, but if I really crank it up, it kind of deforms the head of my fish here. So if I'm going to set this to negative 57%. I kind of want a look a bit like this once I'm happy with it. I mean, you can also use these sliders to kind of control different angles that it's distorted at. For right now, I'm just going to leave these alone. If you do what I just did and you accidentally exit out of a warp effect, or if you want to go back and change a warp effect, You can go into the properties panel, and with the object selected, just hit warp options and it'll bring you back to this menu. So make sure you got the style set to wave, make sure you got it set to vertical, hit bend or change bend to -57%. Make sure horizontal and vertical distortion are set to 0 and then just hit OK. And I'm just going to use my selection tool to move this over here. I want to rotate it. So that way it looks like it's kind of swimming in between these rocks here. So I think that's a good placement for my fish. Oh, and next is I'm going to go back over to this copy here. I'm going to hold Alt. And I have my selection tool selected. I'm holding Alt. I'm clicking on my template and making another copy. I like to keep using copies of a template, so that way if I completely mess up and I just can't undo what I've done to a shape, I always have my original that I can go back and copy. So with this new copy, I'm going to go to Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Warp. This time I'm going to use Arc, and I'm going to set the bend to 42%. Then I'm going to hit OK. And I'm just going to use my selection tool to kind of rotate it around, move it over here. You can also use the angle up here to help rotate it. I want the front end of my fish to be hidden and kind of the back tail to be seen, so that way it looks like it's swimming underneath the leaf. Okay, so kind of get a placement similar to what I have here. It's okay if you're not exact. I might just rotate it up just a little bit more. So another issue I'm having is I'm kind of looking at my fish now, and they're really distinct under the water. I want them to look like they're deeper. So kind of the deeper you go into murky water, the harder it is to define the shapes. So I'm going to select this fish here. I'm going to go back to my transparency panel. I'm going to set this to, as 35% look like. Okay, I think 35% looks good for that one. For this one, I want this one to look like it's closer to the surface than that one. So I'm just going to set this to 50%. Yeah, that looks good. So now if I hit Shift F, I can go into presentation mode and I can see what my art print looks like. So go ahead and save your AI file. If you would like to export this, just go to File, Export, Export As, and that will let you save it as another file type that you can then use for other platforms. And that is it for our lesson this time. If you have any questions, ranting issues, or just feel like showing some love, put those down in the comments. If you'd like to learn more about various digital art topics or see more of what you can create in Illustrator specifically, go ahead and check out our other videos. If you'd like to join us for the next lesson, be sure you subscribe. Keep creating, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.